So I got back to the plant the next day. That was a Friday. I told my boss, who had been on stage himself, and he said, "You're fired."
When it came to playing the villain, many believed Lee Van Cleef was indeed one of the best to ever grace the screen. With more than 170 film and television roles under his belt during a 40-year acting career, it was very shocking when the Golden Boot Award winner revealed that his start in Hollywood was a tragedy.
What does he pay you for murdering me? $500 to get the name.
In this video, we'll take a deep dive into the incredible life of Lee Van Cleef, and how the icon who became best of the bad almost never was. How did Lee find Hollywood fame? Born Lee Clarence LeRoy Van Cleef Jr. to Clarence LeRoy Van Cleef and Marion Lavinia Van Fleet on January 9th, 1925. Baby Lee's first home was in Somerville, New Jersey. With a dad who was a practicing pharmacist and his mom, a concert pianist, it is fair to say that Lee enjoyed a comfortable childhood. His father, Clarence, wanted Lee to be responsible and taught his son to shoot by age 10. And when he was a junior attending Somerville High School around June 1942, he took a summer job on an area farm. As a young boy, Lee loved the sea. So when he decided to quit the farming job in September to start his senior year, he already had a plan in motion to join the U.S. Navy. He was so determined to achieve this that he volunteered as both an air warden and a plane spotter, even as a student. His plan was simple. Just like other high school seniors, he had to pass a lot of condensed courses that certified he had completed high school before he could be allowed to join the service. By the time he graduated at the age of 17, in September 1942, he was ready to enlist in the U.S. Navy. His Navy documents did confirm that Lee received a high school diploma, but before Lee went to war, he had something very important to do. On December 10th, 1943, at 18, Lee made his decision to marry his high school girlfriend, Patsy Ruth Cayley. In 1943, this would be the very first of his failed marriages. On joining the Navy, Lee had to complete military training that would enable him to work as a sonarman, and he got assigned to a submarine chaser, and then to the USS Incredible, which was a small warship for removing naval mines. During the Second World War, the ship, also known as a minesweeper, patrolled the Caribbean before moving to the Mediterranean for Operation Dragoon, participating in the landings in southern France. After that campaign, Lee would find himself and the ship in the Black Sea performing air-sea rescue patrols at a Soviet Navy base at Sevastopol, Crimea, before returning to Palermo, Sicily. Lee then returned home from the war in March 1946. At the point of discharge, the 21-year-old had received his minesweeper patch and earned the rank of Sonarman First Class. Lee received more recognition even after. He was awarded the Good Conduct Medal and the Bronze Star. Also, because of his deployments, Lee racked up more medals, including the World War II Victory Medal. After his service, Lee returned to civilian life. He and his wife, Patsy, started working in a fishing camp in Maine. They were a hard-working couple, and before the end of 1946, he was a farmer on the estate of a prominent socialite. By 1947, the couple would welcome their first child, Alan. The following year, they had their second, Deborah. With the family expanding, Lee started looking for better-paying jobs. His search paid off when he was employed by a Somerville factory, and he maintained a multiple stream of income by doubling as an accountant in his free time. He ran this private practice, taking care of the accounts of several local businesses for almost 5 years while working at the factory. Working in the factory brought him in contact with the Clinton NJ Music Hall players, and he appeared in Our Town and Heaven Can Wait. His interest in amateur theater caused his friends and family to begin to encourage him to pursue his interest and start a career in acting. This was the push Lee needed, and he soon packed his bag and headed to New York. Fortunately, he got a small role in a play called Mr. Roberts. This play became a hit, and Lee was able to go on tour for 15 months, from 1950 to 1951. Luckily for him also, he had done so well with the small role, he was given that producer Stanley Kramer, who was working on the film High Noon at the time, wanted him on the cast of the movie. At first, Lee was supposed to play the role of the deputy in the film, but his nose's structure literally got in the way. Lee's nose had a peculiar build that made him look menacing, and being a tall man of 6 feet 2 inches, he simply fitted the role of villainous character, and Kramer wanted Lee in a role that drew the favor of viewers. So he demanded that Lee have his natural nose surgically altered to give him a less menacing appearance. But Lee didn't want to undergo any procedure, so Kramer decided to make him one of the heavies, and Lee got paid $500 a week. Also, one of the requirements for a heavy was the ability to ride, something Lee didn't know how to do, but being a quick learner, he was able to learn in time. Since High Noon was scheduled to start filming in September 1951, instead of waiting and doing nothing, Lee looked for work as a heavy in whatever production was hiring. Fortunately, he got hired for the role of Rocky Hatch in 2 episodes of Jock Mahoney's syndicated Western series, Range Rider. He also appeared in episode 82 of the TV series The Lone Ranger during this waiting period. The funny thing was, no one knew that Lee had never been on screen before, and The Range Rider was his very first screen role. But this review he got after shooting the film was completely shocking. Someone from the production said, "He came on as an old professional. I liked working with him. He was very handy, did a good fight scene. I sure didn't know it was his first job." And as if to emphasize Lee's natural disposition to play a good villain, his character, the silent gunslinger Jack Colby in High Noon, even without a single word of dialogue, made such a lasting impression on fans who watched the Oscar-winning Western film, they couldn't forget his presence. From here on, Lee played the villain, and he owned this role. It was said that Lee would tell every director who wanted him in their film to ensure the character they wanted him to play, no matter how evil, must not menace a child, kill an animal, or murder a woman. And surprisingly, the directors agreed to Lee's request. Even the great John Ford, playing the villain to perfection for him, was captured when he said, "I believe in showing real violence, not toy violence. Real violence turns you off because you know it's not the thing to do. If you show violence realistic enough, people don't want to do it." Even though Lee may have started with westerns, but he soon showed his versatility in sci-fi and noir films, taking on Kansas City Confidential in 1952 and Vice Squad the following year. He also made his television debut in the episode Formula for Fear of the Western aviation series Sky King. Lee was cast and appeared 6 times on the children's syndicated Western series The Adventures of Kit Carson, which lasted for almost 3 years from 1953 to 1955. Within this period, he slotted in as much work as he could find, appearing as Jesse James in the syndicated series Stories of the Century, and getting work on another syndicated Western series, Annie Oakley. In 1955, he was on the CBS Western series, Brave Eagle. He also played Cherokee Bob in the NBC Western series, Tales of Wells Fargo in 1957. Around this time, Lee and his wife would give birth to their 3rd child, David. But 1958 would turn out to be a trying time for Lee, as nothing prepared him for the experiences he was about to pass through. Driving home after work from Lone Pine, California, which was the location for the film Ride Lonesome, Lee had his wife and 3 children in the car with him, and they had a head-on collision with an oncoming vehicle. This accident left Lee with a double fracture in his left arm and a shattered left kneecap. These serious injuries put him in the hospital for almost a month. The doctors were of the opinion that Lee would never be able to ride a horse again, and even walking would, unfortunately, be with a limp. In what he later defined as mind over matter, Lee would work harder than he had ever done in his life to upturn the doctor's conclusion, and within 6 months, he was able to ride a horse again. However, the accident and the things that occurred during that period led Lee to find solace at the bottom of a bottle. This was the birth of his drinking problem. This problem eventually orchestrated the end of his 15-year marriage, which produced 3 wonderful children. By the end of 1958, Lee and Patsy divorced each other and went their separate ways. Despite the issues he was having, Lee was still getting jobs and doing as much as he could. In 1959, he played Luke Clegg in the episode Strange Request of the NBC's Western series Riverboat, and he found more work in some other ABC and CBS productions. But love wasn't done with Lee, because 2 years after his first divorce, he met and married Joan Marjorie Drain after dating for a while. Together, they adopted a daughter, Denise, and Joan remained a stepmother to Lee's first 3 children. Lee continued to play the villainous character in movies, taking on the role of the swindler in the Bonanza episode, The Bloodline, on December 31st, 1960. He also had a guest appearance on Gunsmoke. In 1961, he was on the third season of The Twilight Zone. The following year, he was in John Ford's The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, with John Wayne and James Stewart. And as usual, Lee was the evil henchman. Despite some projects in 1963, Lee was taking a tumble, career-wise. It wasn't his fault, however, as Western films were taking a hit, as the Western decline of the 1960s reached an all-time high. Lee and many others were struggling to get jobs, and financially things were taking a huge turn for the worse. Joan, his wife, was working as an IBM secretary, and since acting jobs were not forthcoming, Lee had to start doing freelance jobs like house painting and such. In fact, things were so bad that he was reportedly preparing to retire from acting altogether. Fortunately, this tough time did not last, and the Italian director Sergio Leone, who had worked with Clint Eastwood in A Fistful of Dollars to produce a very successful film, decided to do a sequel. This follow-up was titled For a Few Dollars More, and the foreign director decided to try something entirely different. He wanted Lee to play the role of the bounty hunter protagonist. Looking back at the start of his career, Lee could not be more astonished at the turn of events. He was supposed to play the protagonist in High Noon, but couldn't because he refused to do what he wasn't comfortable with, and the punishment for standing his ground was to play the villain. But instead of that punishment ruining his acting career, it even propagated it and helped him move up the Hollywood ladder. Now, after many years of playing the bad man, how was he going to be the protagonist? Especially now that the director intentionally wanted him and gave him the role without any conditions or strings attached. This was the second time Lee's acting career would undergo a change that would leave everyone shocked. Without wasting time, in 1965, Leone cast Lee as the main protagonist alongside Clint Eastwood in For a Few Dollars More. The movie was released in Italy on December 30th, 1965, and it was even more commercially successful than the first film. It wasn't surprising that a year later, Leone decided to call up Lee again to partner with Eastwood in a new movie, which would act as the third and final installment in the Dollars trilogy, following A Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More. This time, however, Lee was the primary antagonist known as Angel Eyes in the 1966 Italian epic spaghetti western The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Here, Eastwood was the good, Lee was the bad, and Eli Wallach was the ugly. The movie, set in the violence of the American Civil War, revolved around three gunfighters who were contending against each other to find a fortune of $200,000 in a buried hoard of Confederate gold. They try to achieve this goal while fighting in the many battles and duels that should end their lives. The film initially faced some critical reviews due to general disapproval of the spaghetti western genre at the time. However, those reviews did not stick or even cause any harm, as the movie was loved by many. It entered cult-like status when fans pinned it as the definition of a spaghetti western. As another financial success, it was even more successful than the first two installments, grossing tens of millions at the global box office. And it didn't just do well financially. It brought fame to almost all the primary characters and even some secondary ones. Lee and Eastwood were major beneficiaries of this exposure. Lee became a major star of spaghetti westerns, now playing the hero in successful movies like the 1966's Big Gun Down, 1967's Death Rides a Horse and Day of Anger, and later, the Grand Duel of the early 1970s. Despite career success, Lee's home was in turmoil and was about to be shaken to its core once again. He and his wife Joan had now been together for 14 years, and their marriage had yet to produce a child. They did adopt a child, Denise, but it wasn't enough to keep these two together, and they filed for a divorce in 1974. The reason, no one knows for sure. But while making 1974's The Stranger and the Gunfighter, Lee met Barbara Heavillone, a concert pianist working on the score for the film. And by 1975, he divorced Joan and married Barbara on July 13, 1976. As it has been observed throughout Lee's life, no personal issue seems to ever interfere with his career. Through the late 1970s, Lee went ahead to make over 20 more spaghetti westerns. Working with other established stars like Jim Brown in another Italian-American co-production, Lee went to Israel to work with Leif Garrett in God's Gun and Kid Vengeance. It didn't stop there. He got a gig acting alongside Chuck Norris in the 1980s martial arts film The Octagon. One of his final big roles was a supporting role in John Carpenter's cult film Escape from New York, which happened a year after the Chuck film. In 1983, all of Lee's struggle and war against the current was recognized, as he was awarded a Golden Boot Award for his immense contribution to the Western film and television genre. Around this time, Lee disappeared from acting for a while, and when he came back in 1984, he had created a TV series, The Master. This he took to NBC and they accepted it, as Lee himself was starring in the show as Ninja Master. In the show, Lee plays John Peter McAllister, an elderly American veteran who stayed behind in Japan after World War II to become a master ninja. Trained by a secret sect, he tries to leave to look for a daughter he didn't know he had, but he is marked for death by his fellow ninjas. So he picks a new student to train, who will help him survive the onslaught of assassins, which includes his own former student. The show went on for 13 episodes before it was canceled. According to reports, the show didn't attract a large enough audience to remain on the air. Unfortunately, this forced Lee to start accepting roles in low-budget movies. Health-wise, Lee had suffered from heart disease since the late 1970s. This had initially slowed his work considerably, but Lee had a pacemaker installed in the early 1980s. But on December 16, 1989, just a few weeks before his 65th birthday, the heart disease would lead to unredeemable consequences. Lee had fallen over at his house in Oxnard, California. He was then rushed to St. John's Hospital, where he eventually gave up the ghost. He and Barbara were together till his death. Part of the causes of death included a secondary cause, throat cancer. Lee smoked heavily, and it was obvious in his movies. He had picked up the habit while in the Navy. After his death, Lee was buried at Forest Lawn Cemetery in Hollywood Hills, California, with many in attendance donning their cowboy hats in honor of the great man. On his grave was inscribed, "The best of the bad," praising his many acting performances as a villain, a role Lee accepted he was born to play. "Bad guys have always been my bag. I look mean without even trying. Audiences just naturally hate me on screen. I could play a role in a tuxedo, and people would think I was rotten. You can do much more with a villain part. Movies are full of leading men, most of whom aren't working. It's much harder to find a good villain." In all, Lee Van Cleef Jr. is credited with many movie roles and TV appearances over his 38 years as an actor, and he has brought some respect to the Italian Western genre.